This is lecture 3 of World War II, and I am happy to say our final lecture of the year for APUSH. It has been a pleasure to be able to share the story of American history with you this year, and I hope that you enjoyed it. I regret that we have been able to finish it out in class, but we're doing the right thing for our country at this time and for the world by staying isolated. But let's finish this thing out strong. Make sure we do well on the exam. So World War II, we left off. The United States had entered into World War II. Now let's talk about what happened after we were involved. And so 3 major conferences that you should know about. One occurred at Tehran in November of 1943, where the United States and the Allies discussed Operation Overlord, which would become the D-Day invasion in France. Yalta in February of 1944, where the Allies discussed German unconditional surrender there, and when Germany was defeated, how they would divide it up and what the post-war occupation zones would look like there in Germany. They discussed the United Nations there at Yalta as well, as far as after the war was over, how would we create an organization that was actually going to work, unlike the League of Nations. Potsdam was the third major conference that you need to know about, and this took place between July and August of 1945, and at this Potsdam conference, they talked about Japanese unconditional surrender and what to do with war criminals, and that would result in the Nuremberg trials. And also coming out of the Potsdam conference is going to be the Potsdam Declaration, where the United States tells Japan to surrender or face immediate destruction. That's where President Truman finds out, because FDR by that point had died. President Truman knows about the development of the atomic bomb, and he's going to warn Japan there as a result. So looking at the war itself, the Atlantic theater of this war, in other words, the European theater for the most part of this war, the Battle of Stalingrad was when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union had a weapon that was very difficult to defend itself. That weapon was called Winter, and at the end of the Battle of Stalingrad, about 800,000 Axis casualties resulted. And so that was extremely destructive to the Germans because they had lost on that front, and then the Soviets would start to close in from the east. Operation Torch in 1942 was where the Allies and the United States invade North Africa. This is going to set up basically a movement towards Egypt and then towards Sicily and Italy, and that's going to lead into Operation Avalanche, which is the invasion of Italy in 1943 and the eventual overthrow of Benito Mussolini. And Operation Overlord, or D-Day, was initiated on June 6, 1944, which is the invasion of France, and that's going to eventually close in on Germany. So since the Allies had been coming in through the south, through Italy, from the west in France, from the east from the Soviet Union, and then bombing raids would go on through Germany to kind of make all the German troops go back into Germany to shore up the homeland. Eventually, the Allies would just close in and defeat them that way through these various offensives. In the Pacific, and VE Day was May 7th, 1945. So that's when you had the official surrender of Germany, and Italy had been defeated before that. In the Pacific, the Allies stop Japanese advance for the first time at Coral Sea in May of 1942. This is the first carrier versus carrier battle. It was a draw, but it stopped the Japanese from advancing. So now it kind of puts them more in a defensive mode. The Battle of Midway in June of 1942 was a successful, so it was an American Allied victory, defense of Midway Island, this Battle of Midway is considered the turning point battle in the Pacific theater of this war. The United States utilized an island hopping strategy of getting closer and closer to Japan by taking over islands. The Japanese were extremely difficult to fight against because there were kamikaze pilots where it's difficult to fight against an enemy that has no fear of death. And this is going to play into a decision later on by President Truman to drop the atomic bombs, because it had kind of become part of the American consciousness and the philosophy of the American military that the Japanese just weren't going to surrender no matter what. Iwo Jima is a famous battle in the Pacific theater, and this was the first defeat of Japan on Japanese homeland in February and March of 1945. And in Okinawa, the United States was able to win there. It was the largest amphibious landing, and that was in April or June, and through June of 1945. So we're getting close at this point to the atomic bombs. Before we get there, I want to talk a little bit about FDR again. Franklin Roosevelt runs and wins a fourth term as president in 1944. Now, I think the man knew that he was sick enough where he probably wasn't going to make it through his fourth term. You see pictures of him in conferences with Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin, and he looks really ill here by 1944. So it's pretty clear to him, but the American people don't necessarily know that because the media didn't, in those days, report everything that the president did. People were unaware of President Roosevelt's many health conditions throughout his entire presidency. So when FDR ran for a fourth term, just to be really clear, no wartime president has ever lost re-election. He was not going to lose re-election here, especially with the way the war was going and people's belief in him through the Great Depression and the New Deal. He wins a fourth term, but he only lives 3 months into his fourth term. And he dies on April 12, 1945. And a little-known vice president, Harry Truman, is sworn into office. Harry Truman was only vice president for 3 months. He hadn't been vice president with FDR for all 4 terms. He was just recently vice president. And when people vote, they often don't care about who the vice presidential candidate is. They just vote for president. So people didn't know who Harry Truman was. Harry Truman becomes president at the end of World War II and is going to have to make the most consequential decision a president perhaps has ever had to make when he decided to drop these bombs. So this little-known Missouri senator becomes president of the United States. Now, I think people recognize that a president serving a long time, serving 4 terms, is not a good idea. Eventually, it's going to result in a constitutional amendment that's going to be pushed for pretty quickly after World War II is over, and it's going to be ratified in 1951. The 22nd Amendment limits the president to 2 terms. So now today, you could not have a 4-term president. 2 terms is the max, up to 10 years if a vice president takes over. 2 terms is the max. At the end of World War II, after the United States develops the bomb through the Manhattan Project and drops Little Boy on Hiroshima and Fat Man on Nagasaki, and the war is over by September 2nd, 1945, after VJ, Victory in Japan Day. The United States emerges from World War II as the world's only superpower because of the development of the bomb. Now, the USSR, Soviet Union, is going to develop the bomb by 1949. So eventually there'll be a second superpower. But at this point, the U.S. is the preeminent power in the world at the end of the war. That's going to be a major outcome of this war. Social effects of World War II, there are many. Some good, some not. One that's not is Japanese internment. President Roosevelt through Executive Order 9066, puts 100,000 Japanese American citizens and Japanese immigrants into what were called internment camps. People were pulled out of their homes. They had to leave their place of business and put into these jails because they were suspected as being spies. So this is a clear, along with the court packing, trying to get the Supreme Court up to 15 members. It's an example that FDR did some things that weren't so great too. And the Japanese internment is a kind of a disgraceful thing that happened during this time period, unfortunately. Some positives. Civil rights movement really begins during World War II. Groups like the Tuskegee Airmen helped gain honor for African Americans in battle. In World War I, it was the Harlem Hellfighters. World War II, we had the Tuskegee Airmen, who were under enemy fire more than any other group at that time. And so they are famous, and that gains a lot of respect. African American soldiers during the war started what was called the Double V campaign: victory over discrimination at home, victory over tyranny abroad. So to the two V's, the two victories, double V. This is all going to lead eventually to the desegregation of the armed forces. This is going to be the last war where you have a segregated military. Harry Truman, President Truman, is going to desegregate the military, and then the next war after this, the Korean War, we would have a fully integrated armed force. Women's rights accelerate as a result of World War II. The image of the women who were workers during this war is kind of most notable through Rosie the Riveter. And on the Rosie the Riveter poster, it says, "We can do it." And women filled in for men who had left to fight the war. Many women served in the war, not as soldiers, but in other roles. And so women gained a lot more respect as a result. And although women had suffrage by this point, that was passed through in the 19th Amendment, women still were not treated equally in virtually every other aspect of society. This helps women gain a little bit more respect and move closer to that. Native Americans gained a lot of respect during this war. FDR had treated Native Americans better than any previous president up to that point. But a lot of respect goes to them during the war effort because maybe the most famous, the Navajo code talkers, who were able to transmit messages without the Japanese being able to decode them because, well, nobody in Japan spoke Navajo. So you could relay messages. Navajo could relay messages, and the Japanese were not able to really intercept and interpret those messages. That was an important aspect that would help Native Americans gain more respect in this country. Hispanic Americans also gained more respect in the United States as a result of World War II, largely by not only fighting in the war, but also many people coming over through the Bracero program, working in the United States as migrant farm workers and migrant workers in general from places like Mexico. So the Bracero program was an important thing that helped the United States in many aspects economically be able to win this war. And the cost and the legacy of World War II in terms of just pure death, 4% of the world's population dies during World War II. And that includes 45 million civilians. A lot of innocent people were in cities that were bombed. 10 million people died during the Holocaust. So we have all sorts of different problems that come along with war, obviously. And a lot of innocent people lost their lives, including a lot of soldiers. So civilians and soldiers, huge toll. U.S. debt multiplied by 10 during World War II. We spent more money from 1941 to 1945 than we had spent as a nation from 1776 to 1941. So it was an expensive war. Wars are expensive, and so eventually this cost $306 billion. Today, $306 billion for for the United States in terms of debt is just like I don't know, an hour